everyone. This week kicks off our final unit, though we've been studying the art of analysis the whole semester. Every essay we've read has sought to offer an analytical argument on a topic, mostly monsters according to our theme. In my video on the analysis essay earlier this week, I stressed that a key element of an analysis is bringing an analytical tool to the table. Specialized research that helps you to examine a topic from a unique angle. I'll discuss the readings for this week and in the coming weeks in terms of how the authors approach their topics with particular tools, and you'll be considering what topic you want to pursue and how you want to approach your analysis of it. Some of you may choose to expand upon your critique papers, and some of you may explore new topics of your choosing, which can go outside of this monster theme. I'll continue with this theme for the most part in our last weeks, as I do think it serves to show that with a broad topic, with a long history and lots of different scholarship, you can build on what has come before while still carving out your own perspective and argument. This week it's vampires, next week true crime, and the week after a switch to heroes and villains. So we're getting to the human monster, as it were. But today, let's take a look at why, according to Guillermo del Toro and Chuck Hogan, vampires never die, and how, according to Karen Backstein, we might analyze their presence in popular culture. I also assigned a reading from Wired magazine, The Evolution of the Vampire, which was basically just a list of vampire stories and films throughout the years, actually an incredibly small sampling, though a diverse one. Try looking up vampire films or vampire literature, TV series, comics, video games on Wikipedia, and you'll see how lengthy those lists actually are. But even here, we can chart some of the important changes over the years, especially if you're familiar with any of the examples that the article gave or watched any of the videos that the article linked to, or the ones that weren't broken anyway. So we move from early 19th century vampire stories to the 21st century, and along the way you find exploration of different kinds of fears and desires, some consistent over time and others unique to the historical moment in which they were produced. Some things about the vampire stay the same, but other elements evolve over time to meet the needs and wants of that moment, which can have as much to do with entertainment trends as psychological, political impulses. This list was published 6 years ago, and since then there have been a number of different films, TV shows, novels, games that have come out that deal with the vampire. Here are just a few from the last year. We've got V-Wars on Netflix, which features former Vampire Diaries star Ian Somerhalder, showing that this topic is rich enough that a guy can make a career out of it. Nosferatu, which I believe is based off of something Stephen King related, as we have many adaptations of his work, and we read him right at the beginning of the semester. At any rate, this one advertises itself as a different kind of vampire story, since evolution and novelty is key. We've got the comedy series What We Do in the Shadows, which actually sprung out of a film of the same name that came back a few years back, and then another series on Netflix that goes all the way back to Dracula again, but presumably in some fresh way. So the vampire, like the zombie, doesn't seem to be going anywhere. Del Toro and Hogan, as well as Backstein, all seek to analyze the continued but evolving appeal of the vampire, which is a question that can be approached and analyzed in a number of different ways. One of the reasons the vampire persists is its ability to adapt with the times. Professor of English Nina Auerbach wrote a landmark study of vampires back in 1995, Our Vampires Ourselves, that covered the evolution from the 19th century to the 20th, tying, in fact, the AIDS crisis of the 80s into vampire stories of the time. She noted that since vampires are immortal, they are free to change incessantly, which Del Toro and Hogan and Backstein echo. this is true within each vampire story. Most live centuries until a stake to the heart might stop them, so we see the characters try to fit into each new era in some way. And likewise, the stories we tell about them evolve. Del Toro and Hogan point out that as a seductive figure, the vampire is as flexible and polyvalent as ever. Witness its slow mutation from the pansexual, decadent Anne Rice creatures to the current permutations, promising anything from chaste eternal love to wild nocturnal escapes. And there you will find the true essence of immortality, adaptability. So as diverse as vampire stories are, Del Toro and Hogan find it useful to develop categories, and they narrow in on two: vampire as undead monster and vampire as romantic hero, and sometimes those can occur in one story simultaneously. So a vampire can be frightening and desirable. Why? According to these guys, in contrast to timeless creatures like the dragon, the vampire does not seek to obliterate us, but instead offers a peculiar brand of blood alchemy. For as his contagion bestows its nocturnal gift, the vampire transforms our vile mortal selves into the gold of eternal youth, and instills in us something that every social construct seems to quash: primal lust. So there are definitely stories of vampires that do seek to obliterate, to feed and kill, to destroy, but even those presumably build their packs, as you see in a film like 30 Days of Night, transmitting vampirism like an infection, something more akin to zombie stories that actually we see in Del Toro and Hogan's book and TV series The Strain, which I think in promotion for which they wrote this article, and in shows like the one I mentioned earlier, V-Wars. Then you also have the vampire who chooses to turn a victim to a vampire, offering it as a gift, eternal life, one that we've pondered since our earliest mythology, so many of our stories dealing with life and death. In that way, the vampire may be one of the most human of monsters, forcing us to confront our mortality and what life is for. We might take Del Toro and Hogan's categories that they use to help them analyze, and then think about them in terms of two thematic categories: fear and desire, and how they intersect. Early vampire stories already were pretty complex in their exploration of these primal urges, as Del Toro and Hogan say. Dracula offers death and life. He serves as a metaphor for what is different or what is hidden. He manages to pass off as an exotic European moving to London, both seducing and killing women. The one who gives in to desire dies. The woman who resists lives. That's a bit of an oversimplification, and there's a lot more that the novel does. As Del Toro and Hogan point out, it's actually embedded in a really interesting way in emerging technologies at the end of the 19th century. But this idea that desire is something to fear, that in a rather repressed Victorian society you might explore it in a novel of monsters that can be killed off at the end, thus safely enclosing any tempting blood-sucking within the covers of the book, that's a theme that continues. Over time, with books and films like Interview with the Vampire, in the bottom corner there, check out Blonde Tom Cruise, we see vampires as more explicitly sexual, if still quite dangerous. In other stories, same-sex vampire and victim allowed a closeted means to explore homosexual desire. Often stories with fantastical creatures allow us to explore things in metaphor until they can be spoken more plainly, so that you later get a show like HBO's True Blood, which is very open about sexuality and whose tagline for the first season in this show about modern vampires joining the world of humans, coming out of the coffin is what they called it. So that's a pretty dead-on commentary on early 21st century gay rights movements. We also get vampire heroes and anti-heroes, like Wesley Snipes there in the other bottom corner. You got his teeth bared, who was actually one of the first successful comic book characters adapted into a movie franchise back in 1998. That is a character from Marvel. There were 3 films in total in the Blade franchise, and this was one of the early indicators that Marvel Comics could make movies. Blade was a hybrid vampire character who fought other vampires, a monster fighting monster, super heroic in his special powers, highlighting a different kind of vampire desire, a desire to instill fear, to fight what is feared, with the gift, as Del Toro and Hogan call it, of the vampire. We don't just get eternal youth, sex, avoiding death. We also get power, and a power fantasy of sort. Now with Twilight, we arguably return to a kind of repression of desire, as Karen Backstein's article argues. Well, maybe not a repression so much as a safe exploration of desire, with a rather defanged vampire figure. Why take the dangerous, libidinous vampire of Interview with a Vampire and True Blood, and then instead offer up a vegetarian, sparkling, romantic vampire like Edward Cullen? Well, that's part of an evolution of the figure that Backstein found curious enough to decide to analyze. In Backstein's essay, Unsafe Sex, so unsafe or safe sex, romancing the vampire, she investigates something that interested her: new vampire stories that alter the traditional sexual dynamic of the vampire narrative. As she notes, just as the eternally living creature within the narrative must adapt to the passing centuries in dress and manner, the fictional construction of the protagonist has had to shift in order to survive as a meaningful symbol for audiences with modern sensibilities. Ultimately, Backstein is using Twilight as a case study due to its huge popularity in the early 2000s, a sort of fusion of romance novel and horror, a creature often categorized as a monster now introduced as a viable romantic partner. So she ends up breaking her article down into different categories. She looks at, okay, what is the appeal of the vampire as lover? The characteristics of the female protagonist, which presumably stand in for the female reader or viewer who would identify with her, how the female perspective drives the narrative, that this is a particularly feminine story about monsters, how sex and romance can be explored through this kind of story, and the threats and dangers that remain. Even in a genre that's more romance than horror, we still have a sense of danger, a sense of threat, but it's not necessarily coming from the foremost vampire figure. So Backstein develops an argument in her article out of an initial curiosity about a particular phenomenon, and that comes from finding analytical approaches that hone her focus, allow her to observe her subject carefully, and interpret her findings for her readers who might not see her topic this way if not for her writing. That's your goal in writing your own analysis. To write an analytical argument, you need an analytical tool, a principle or definition that generally comes from research or logic that you can apply to your topic, a lens through which you examine the parts of something, be it a film series or a moment in history, a debate in politics or cultural obsession, whatever it might be, and using those tools to help you interpret and argue for the meaning or significance of your topic. Backstein is working with several different tools in order to understand the appeal of Twilight and to make her own argument about why it became popular in a particular moment, how it speaks more broadly to women's desire in stories. She defines the traits of a hero, which can differ over time as well, and she notes from research that Edward is very much an old-fashioned sort of hero, of the type of 19th century gentleman. She studies how narratives work, how conventions of romance are used, as well as horror, to make something new and particularly female-centric. She establishes a kind of working definition of female desire, particularly among younger readers who may be trying to safely explore something that can feel quite unwieldy and dangerous. And she definitely draws upon a history in film analysis to examine scenes from Twilight in detail, looking at plot, visuals, sound, all tools that, employed carefully, can construct an essay that helps the reader to see something that the writer sees. I encourage you to go back over Backstein's essay with this in mind. Look for how she explores her topic. How does she take these definitions and principles, even if she doesn't come out and say, as you might have done in one of your papers, according to dictionary.com, desire is, in her introduction, and then use that to focus her argument. You've done that before, some of you. So you've therefore been setting up and applying an analytical tool right from an introduction. But we're going to do this in a more advanced, more research-driven way. The idea remains the same, though, that you need to build your argument off of something. And that starts from just how you examine your topic, the lens through which you choose to view it. But I do want to take a quick look at some of the passages from Backstein's article and highlight how she goes about conducting her analysis. She sets up a working definition of how previous vampire stories have operated. She notes that while the vampire in almost every artistic incarnation symbolizes impossible desire and transgressed boundaries, Twilight shifts that. Rather than the vampire offering temptation of sex, the Twilight narrative draws a distinction between sexual threats and romantic love, which Backstein notes might be directed toward young readers, teenage girls, and may be influenced by author Stephanie Meyer's religious beliefs. She notes that the gentlemanly Edward not only refuses sex because of the danger to Bella, he fears he could hurt her, perhaps succumb to the desire to drink her blood, just as we talk about sexual temptation being overcome with, as Del Toro and Hogan pointed out, primal lust. But Backstein goes on to note that he also swoops in to pluck her out of sexually threatening situations. Whenever someone in Twilight does want sex or can't control desire, he is evil. Backstein relies upon contrast here. More sexually explicit romance novels, as well as a history of the kind of highly sexed, primal lust vampire that Del Toro and Hogan referred to. And she shows how Edward serves as a kind of fusion. With model good looks and the slight bad boy appeal of literally being able to kill you, Edward becomes appealing because he, unlike the human men, will not hurt her, exercising heroic self-control as a show of love, which makes him all the more attractive to Bella. As Backstein says, we still get all of the hints of Edward's physical prowess, however, so that viewers can presumably read between the lines, and overt sexuality does occur but is reserved for after their marriage. So the vampire becomes an alternative to human monsters, which is actually a trend that is played out in other vampire stories. Sometimes humans are the most monstrous, like the would-be attackers who stalk Bella at night, with Edward's superpowers allowing him to save her. Backstein really relies upon film analysis in this part of the essay, a close study of how scenes are shot to reveal meaning, to show contrast, to develop character, to highlight themes. The tools you use in your analysis determine what you focus on and what you can show your reader. we'll look at different examples of analytical tools in the coming weeks, but we do see how Baxine is establishing the tools she wants to work with in order to make her argument about the appeal of Twilight, why we shift from this other kind of vampire to the one that became so popular. So let's say we wanted to use Baxine as either a source or a jumping off point for an analytical project of our own. There are a lot of other avenues to explore to potentially contrast. We could look at the appeal of the vampire lover more broadly. Are there female vampires targeted toward men? Are there same-sex vampire romances? Yes, there are. There's also the more sexualized True Blood and stories like that one. We could examine how this female perspective drives the narrative. Why have these stories become targeted toward women? Why do many involve romance? There's a recent book series / TV series called A Discovery of Witches, which, despite the title, also involves vampires, and it actually advertises itself as Twilight for grown-ups, True Blood with a PhD. So this trend is still continuing even into the little bit later part of our 2020 now. So we might consider what kind of analytical approaches would help for investigating one of these topics. Would you research into the romance genre in general in order to see how vampire romances adhere and differ? You would conduct research to know if this is still a trend, and are there counterexamples and other researchers who are looking at them? What kind of research would you conduct? Next week, we'll take a look at an article on Jeffrey Dahmer and one about America's obsession with true crime, shows, podcasts, and we'll study how these writers analyze their subjects. As you read, look for the tools they use, their research, definitions, principles, concepts, the lenses through which they look, be they historical, psychological. You'll see a lot of different things. So begin thinking about what topic you want to explore for your analysis paper, and let me know if you have questions or ideas, and we'll see how that develops. I'm looking forward to what you guys end up coming up with. I'm looking forward to grading your critique papers, and I wish you all a good weekend. So I'll talk to you via video on Monday as we tackle our next batch of readings and really start thinking about how you will write your analysis essay.